Hello everyone from the Secrets of Betrayal channel. My name is Wendy, I'm married, and today I want to tell you about the day I had a relationship with my father-in-law. Stay until the end, subscribe to the channel, and don't miss any details. Come on. Linden Grove isn't the kind of town you see in movies. The streets are quiet, with spaced-out houses and well-kept gardens. When you walk through the streets in the morning, the smell of fresh coffee mixes with the freshness of the countryside, and there are few cars passing by. The city seems to exist in a space outside of time, where the inhabitants go about their routines unhurriedly, and life goes on at a pace without too many surprises. I've always liked this tranquility, or rather, I liked it. At first, when I moved here with my husband Tom, I saw all this calm as a refuge. It was as if I had found a permanent home after years of uncertainty and change. But now, as the years passed, the calm of Linden Grove began to feel like a weight, a silent weight that enveloped me in its stillness and made me realize the growing void between me and my husband. Tom was no longer there. He was a man of 35, tall and with a firm posture, but inside he had turned into someone distant and almost cold. He had always been a good man, or so I thought, hard-working, honest, with a great sense of responsibility. He had his own ideals, and always believed that hard work was the key to securing a better future. And in many ways, he was right. He managed to get a good job at the local factory, and with that, our life began to stabilize. But over time, the factory became more important than the house, more important than me. It was like we were in a boat, both rowing in different directions. I was still trying to keep the marriage afloat, but it seemed to be sinking, slowly, without me knowing what to do. He'd come home from a long day at work and barely spoke to me, or worse, when he did, it was about the company's targets, the numbers that needed to be reached. There was no room for us. There was no more us. I was a 33-year-old woman, married for 9 years, but I felt as if I had forgotten myself over the years. My name is Wendy, and as I looked out of the window of our house, I wondered where it all started to break down. Maybe it was those nights when, at bedtime, I found myself in silence, staring at the ceiling while he snored beside me. Maybe it was when we started to give up talking about anything beyond our daily chores. That night was one of those. The rain was starting to fall softly outside, and the sound of the drops hitting the window was mixed with the noise of the fan. Tom was in front of the TV as usual, on his sofa, eyes fixed on the screen. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, but my mind was elsewhere. He barely noticed when I went into the living room to get the remote control. The silence between us seemed deafening. Every day, it seemed that the words I tried to say were lost in the air, without reaching his attention. "Tom, are you going to eat or not?" I asked, trying to strike up a conversation. Any conversation. He looked at me quickly, without really seeing me. "Oh, I've already eaten. No problem." His voice was monotonous, as if he was speaking out of obligation rather than interest. I suddenly felt empty. Not just because he didn't care how I felt, but because I had also lost interest in trying anymore. There was no more strength in my chest to keep fighting for something that didn't seem to want to be saved. All that was left was emptiness. I decided to go to my room, trying to avoid another pointless argument. I needed some kind of distraction, something to take my mind off the boring routine. The television, the books, the chores. Everything seemed so mechanical, as if I were living a life that wasn't mine. When I went into the bedroom, I lay down on the bed and looked out of the window. The rain was heavier now, and I was lost in my own thoughts. I knew I was unhappy. I knew he was too, but nobody talked about it. That's when the phone rang. "Hi, Wendy. It's me, Harold." My father-in-law's voice sounded on the other end of the line, soft, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling. Harold, my father-in-law, was a man in his 60s, with gray hair and a calm gaze. He always treated me with affection, but was never overly invasive. He lived in an old house in the next town, and whenever he visited, he brought a sense of comfort, like an old friend who understood the complexities of life. "Hello, Harold. How are you?" I replied, trying to hide the sadness in my voice. "Well, as much as possible. I was wondering, why don't you come over for a coffee? It's raining hard out there, and you don't look very well." His voice had a worried tone, as if he knew I was too tired to hide what was going on. I hesitated for a moment. I didn't want to go, but at the same time, something inside me felt that I needed to. I needed a break, an escape, someone I could talk to. Maybe it was a chance to take a breather, even if it was only for a few hours. Okay, I'll come over. My voice came out weaker than I would have liked. In a few minutes, I put on a coat and drove to Harold's house in silence. On the way, I couldn't stop thinking about what was happening in my life. Tom had become a stranger to me, and I didn't know what to do to rekindle the flame between us. But what motivated me to leave home at that moment wasn't just the failed marriage. It was the fact that Harold always knew how to listen to me. He was someone I could talk to, someone who didn't judge me. I arrived at his house, which was simple but cozy. The smell of fresh coffee greeted me at the door, and as I entered, Harold was sitting at the table, looking at the newspaper. He stood up quickly and smiled. "Come in, Wendy. Have a seat over here." He pointed to the chair next to him. I sat down, grateful for the hot coffee he served me. The first few minutes were silent, but the familiarity of the house gave me a sense of relief. I needed to talk, and Harold knew it, without me having to say a word. "So, what's going on?" he finally asked, his voice calm and measured. I tried not to cry, but the pain was building up inside me. How hard it was to admit to someone that my marriage was in ruins, that everything I had built up now seemed to be crumbling at my feet. "I don't know. I guess Tom and I don't talk like we used to." I paused for a moment, searching for the right words. "He's always so busy with work that he hardly sees me. And I feel so alone, Harold." He watched me in silence for a moment, as if processing my words. The sound of the rain outside seemed to increase, but inside the house, it felt like a refuge. "Sometimes people move away, Wendy. It just happens. But you have to talk about it. Try to understand what's happened, what's changed. We can't expect others to guess how we feel," he said, with a wisdom that came from a long life full of experiences. I took a deep breath. Maybe that was what was missing. I knew Tom was distant, but perhaps I had also distanced myself from him. It wasn't just him who was responsible for all this, but me too. I had forgotten myself, who I really was. It was as if I was living for the other person, without living for myself. We talked for a while longer, about everything and nothing, and little by little, I felt as if the weight on my chest was getting lighter. Harold knew exactly how to calm me down, how to give me some relief, even for a moment. When I said goodbye and drove home, the rain was still falling heavily. I knew I had a long way to go. I didn't know what to do about my marriage, but at least at that moment I felt a little lighter. As I entered the house, I saw Tom sitting on the sofa, engrossed in the television. He hadn't even noticed me. I looked at him and, for a brief second, I felt nostalgic for what we had been. But then reality hit me hard. Perhaps it was too late. You have no idea what's going to happen. Subscribe to the channel. Stay until the end and don't miss the details. The rain wouldn't stop. In Linden Grove, the weather seemed to drag on as predictably as the leaves falling from the trees in the gardens of the houses. Winter was coming, and with it, the grayness of the sky blended with my mood. Each day seemed to be a repeat of the last. The same routine, the same silences, the same empty spaces between Tom and me. I could hardly remember the last time something genuine had happened between the two of us. When I say genuine, I mean something more than automatic words and gestures. Something that came from deep within us. Something that burned with the intensity of real passion. There was no more of that. Deep down, we both knew that the flame that ignited our relationship had gone out a long time ago. But instead of facing reality, we settled into the routine of the house, between the walls that seemed to grow thicker by the day. It was with this in mind that I found myself back at Harold's house. On that gray afternoon, with the strong wind dragging the leaves to the corners of the streets, I sought the solace of his calm and welcoming gaze. I knew he wouldn't judge me. Unlike Tom, who always seemed too busy to see me, Harold looked at me with the attention that was missing from my life. He had a way of listening that seemed to absorb every word without rushing to respond. but his words were always the right ones, the ones that made me reflect on what was inside me. With each meeting, I began to realize how different he was from Tom. Not just physically, although the age differences between them were obvious, but in the way they behaved. Tom was always in a hurry, always trying to conquer the outside world, while Harold seemed to have already found his peace, not in great conquests, but in small moments of contemplation. It was as if he understood that life wasn't about chasing after material things, but about finding meaning in the simple things. I arrived at his house that day, feeling the weight of the marriage becoming more and more unbearable. The conversation I'd had with Tom the night before hadn't changed anything. He was even more distant than before. I felt a growing desire to run away, to lose myself somewhere where no one would see me, where I would no longer be Tom's neglected and invisible wife. Harold greeted me at the door, as always, with a serene smile. That peaceful smile always seemed to calm me down, as if the very act of seeing him was a balm for the pain I carried inside. "Clara, he said, opening the door a little wider for me to enter. "Come in, it's a bit cold outside." I walked in, feeling the warmth of the house envelop me. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, and soft music played in the background, adding to the welcoming feeling. Harold was in his small but well-organized kitchen, and I sat at the table while he prepared the coffee. "You look a bit tired today, more than usual," he said, with a careful tone of voice, as if he already knew what I was feeling without having to ask. I sighed, trying to organize the words in my head. Harold was in no hurry, and I knew that he would give me space to say whatever I needed, or simply leave me in silence, if that was the case. "Tom and I were worse off than ever, Harold," I began, my voice low, with a tone of frustration I didn't even know I had. He turned, looking at me intently, but in no hurry to intervene. He just waited, as if he knew I needed to get everything out in the open. "What's going on?" he asked softly, as he placed 2 cups of coffee on the table. I looked into the cup, feeling the warmth of Harold's hands coming closer. The next thing I knew, my mind was filled with contradictory thoughts, and I began to speak more quickly, as if the words wanted to escape once and for all. "I don't know what to do anymore. He's always at work. He won't talk to me, he won't look at me." I paused, trying to control my emotion. I don't know how we got here. When we got married, it was so different. I felt loved, wanted. Now it's like I'm just a shadow in his life. Harold sat down at the table and looked at me for a long moment. His expression was thoughtful, but also full of understanding. There was no judgment in his gaze. He knew how hard I was trying to save something that had been lost for a long time. "Wendy," he said, his voice so calm that it seemed to have the power to calm even my inner storm. "Sometimes people get lost in the things they do, in their work, in their obligations, in the expectations they create for themselves and for others. But the truth is that deep down, we all want to be seen. And you, Wendy, deserve to be seen." Those words touched me more than I expected. I felt as if, finally, someone understood me, someone who wasn't trying to solve my problems, but simply saw what I was going through. I missed that. I missed being listened to, missing being important to someone. Not that Tom didn't have his qualities, but he was never good at listening to me, and that had created a barrier between us. "Do you see me, Harold?" I asked, not really thinking about what I was saying. He looked at me for a long moment, and his answer was calm but full of meaning. "Always, Wendy. I'll see you," he said with a lightness in his voice, but with a look that seemed to penetrate deep down, as if he knew more about me than I knew about myself. That disarmed me. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions, a mixture of relief and fear. I knew he was being sincere. He could see me. I could see in his eyes that he wasn't just saying it to please me, but at the same time, this sincerity made me vulnerable. Somehow he was occupying a space in my life that I hadn't planned on, and that scared me. I knew I shouldn't get attached to those simple gestures of affection, of understanding. But the truth was that I was in need, and Harold was offering me exactly what I needed: attention, empathy, welcome. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully. We chatted about trivia, the weather, the city, but there was a tension in the air, something silent and palpable. With every word, every glance exchanged, I felt the weight of what was happening between us. I didn't know what was going on, but I didn't want to interrupt what I was feeling. I didn't want to push away the feeling of being cared for. When I finally got up to leave, Harold walked me to the door. The rain was still falling heavily outside, and he put his hand gently on my shoulder before I left. "Wendy, you're always welcome here," he said with a smile that conveyed more than words could express. I nodded, speechless. Only a simple thank you came out of my mouth, and I walked out to the car, feeling a mixture of confusion and relief. I knew there was something more between us now, something that couldn't be undone by simply walking away. The line between friendship and something more was becoming increasingly blurred, and I didn't know if I wanted to or could go back. Winter in Linden Grove seemed to drag on, as if time was stuck in a state of suspension, and I couldn't find my place in it. The leaves that had already fallen from the fall were turning to dust on the sidewalks, and the biting cold of the season seeped through every crack in the house. Everything around me seemed gray, a lifeless palette, and I found myself sinking deeper and deeper into my own loneliness, without anyone around me noticing. Tom continued his usual routine, absent both physically and emotionally. He spent more hours than ever at work, always justifying his lack of time as a price to pay for the success, the financial stability we had achieved over the years. But I was no longer so interested in the justifications. What I lacked was his attention, the gaze that no longer sought me out, the touch that no longer seemed necessary. Our marriage had become an emptiness, and every day I sank deeper into it, like a tree that, even though it's standing, can no longer nourish itself from the dry earth that surrounds it. It was on one of those gray afternoons, when the rain was still pounding on the windows and the daylight seemed to hide behind dense clouds, that I found Harold again. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for when I picked up the phone and called him. Something inside me urged me to go to him, to feel again that sensation of being heard, of being seen. I knew I was on the brink of something dangerous, but I was so wrapped up in my own pain that any promise of consolation seemed to be an urgent relief. And Harold, with his calm gaze and thoughtful words, seemed to be the only place where I could still find some peace. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. His familiar voice, calm and welcoming, immediately enveloped me, as if the simple act of hearing his voice was a refuge from the internal storm that was tormenting me. "Wendy?" he said, his voice soft and deep. "Are you all right?" Different. I hesitated for a moment, trying to gather the courage to be honest, to admit that something inside me was breaking. But at the same time, I didn't want to appear weak or desperate. I knew he would see me, understand me. But what was going on inside me was more than just confusion. It was a search for something that I knew I shouldn't be searching for. I don't know, Harold. Finally, the word came out of my lips like a whisper. "I need to talk to you. Can I come over?" His answer was immediate, without hesitation. "Of course, Wendy. I'm right here. Come when you can." When I ended the call, I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone, as if it were possible to make a simple choice. But I knew I had already gone too far. I was sinking deeper into something I could no longer control. And yet, the desire to see Harold, to feel safe in his eyes, was stronger than reason. I arrived at Harold's house in the late afternoon, when the sky was darkening, and the wind was already carrying the scent of night. He welcomed me with his usual smile, a smile that seemed to carry a promise of understanding. He made me sit down at the table, where hot tea was already prepared, and the soft light from the ceiling lamps created delicate shadows on the aged wooden walls. Harold's home, simple and welcoming, had always had a calming effect on me. There was something about the way he lived that made me feel protected, as if I were in a refuge from the outside world. I settled into the chair, trying to disguise the tension in my body. Harold noticed immediately. "Wendy, what happened?" he asked, with concern on his face. "You seem to be carrying the world on your back. If you like this story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel." I laughed weakly, yet another way of trying to chase away the feelings that were bubbling up inside me. He knew. He always knew when something was wrong, but instead of pushing me, he just watched me patiently, waiting for me to be able to get the right words out. "I can't take it anymore," I finally spoke, breaking the silence. "Tom is becoming more and more distant, and I don't know what to do. I feel invisible, Harold, as if I didn't matter to him anymore." He didn't answer straight away. His eyes were fixed on me, but it was a deep look, as if he was trying to see beyond the words, beyond the pain I was trying to hide. He was never one to give quick advice. Instead, he gave me the space to come to my own conclusions. "You're losing yourself, Wendy," he said, his voice soft but full of truth. "Sometimes we get lost in other people's expectations, in what we think we need to do to please them, to keep things in order. And in the end, we forget who we really are, what we really need." I looked at him, feeling the words resonate inside me. Something in him had always known what I couldn't express. I found myself, at that moment, at a crossroads, but I still didn't know which path to take. The silence between us stretched on for a few minutes. I could feel the tension growing, as if something was about to happen, although I still didn't have the courage to name it. I wanted more. I wanted to feel what I no longer felt with Tom. I wanted to feel that there was still desire, that someone wanted me. Harold got up and walked over to the window, looking out at the cloudy sky as if he were pondering his words. I continued to sit, motionless, watching his every move, the way his shoulders rose and fell with each breath, the lightness of his body that contrasted with the weight I carried inside me. "Wendy," he said, his voice low, but laden with a tension that I couldn't ignore. "Sometimes the pain of loneliness makes us do things we shouldn't do, but there's no shame in feeling, in being human." Those words fell on me like a silent storm. I felt the desire for something more, something forbidden, growing inside me. He was so close, and the distance between us seemed to disappear. The warmth of his body drew me in, and I was losing the ability to resist. "Harold," my voice came out shaky, almost inaudible, but he heard me. He always heard me. He turned to me, his eyes fixed on mine, without fear, without hesitation. I knew he knew. He knew what I wanted, and somehow he felt it too. He took a step in front of me, and it was as if the space between us dissolved with tension. I wanted to resist. I wanted to turn back, to close the door on these feelings that were consuming me. But the desire to feel something real, to be seen in a way that no one else seemed capable of seeing, took hold of me. And then, without another word, he reached out and gently touched my hand. The simple touch was enough to break down the last barrier I had erected. I looked at him, my heart beating faster, and before I could think of anything else, he pulled me closer, his lips meeting mine with an intensity I hadn't expected. It was a mixture of desperation and need, something that was growing in me by the second. And when the kiss deepened, I knew something was happening, something that could no longer be ignored. I was crossing a line that I didn't know if I could turn back. The awareness that this was wrong was swallowed up by the storm of emotions that were now taking over me. Harold wanted me. I wanted Harold, and in that moment, that truth became more Wendy than anything I'd felt in years. But at the same time, a part of me knew that this moment would bring consequences. Consequences that I might not be able to bear. After the kiss was where it all happened. We connected, and I finally let go of what had been holding me back. The next morning was a storm of thoughts, an internal whirlwind that wouldn't calm down. I woke up in my bed, the sheets tangled around my body, as if they wanted to hold me back from a reality I no longer wanted to face. The first lights of the morning penetrated through the window, but for me, the light of that day seemed more opaque, more distant, as if the world around me had become colorless. And it was with this feeling of detachment that I dragged myself into the bathroom, looking at my reflection in the mirror. I looked the same, but something in me had changed. The woman looking back at me wasn't the same as yesterday. Or maybe she was. But now I was carrying something I never would have imagined. The weight of an irrevocable decision. Of a mistake. A choice that couldn't be undone. The night with Harold was intense, a mixture of repressed desire and a desperate search for something I knew was lost. He wanted me, and I wanted him. When he kissed me, something inside me broke. But now, with the silence back, with time giving me space to reflect on everything that had happened, I felt suffocated by guilt. I knew I was making a mistake, but at the same time, I couldn't deny that that night made me feel alive again, in a way I hadn't felt for years. I thought about Tom again, and the pain of knowing that I had betrayed him with his own father hit me like an unexpected wave. Shame began to eat me up inside. How had I gotten to this point? How could I have ignored all the signs that I was sinking into something destructive? Harold was, in many ways, everything I didn't know I needed. But the pain of having betrayed Tom's trust cut me like a sharp blade. The truth was that while Harold offered the listening I so desperately craved, Tom neglected me. He was more concerned with the factory, with its figures, with his vision for the future, than with what was happening inside our house. But I knew that didn't justify what I had done. Nothing did. I looked at my reflection in the mirror one more time and felt a wave of self-disgust. When I finally went down to the kitchen, the smell of the fresh coffee Tom had made seemed more bitter than usual. He was there, sitting at the table, leafing through the newspaper as he always did, an image that had become almost a caricature of what we had been. "Good morning?" His voice was monotone, emotionless as always. I tried to answer, but the words seemed stuck in my throat. What could I say? How could I look at him without the weight of what we had done becoming unbearable? All I wanted was to get out of there, to run far away, where I could find some kind of peace. But I knew I couldn't escape. The guilt was in me, ingrained, like a poisonous plant that was taking me over little by little. "You seem distant." Tom looked at me, his eyes tired. "Did you sleep well?" I didn't answer immediately. He didn't notice, but everything in me was screaming. I wanted to scream, to tell him the truth, to say that I couldn't take it anymore, that I was lost, that I didn't know who I was anymore, but the words wouldn't come out. Not anymore. I didn't know what to do. I knew that if I carried on pretending that nothing had happened, I would end up destroying myself, but at the same time, I was afraid to put my cards on the table, afraid of what it could mean for both of us, for our marriage. I knew that the line between redemption and the end was already very thin, but I still hesitated. Tom got up and walked over to the sofa, where he turned on the television. He always did this in the morning, as if the sound of the TV was a way of escaping from what was really going on in our lives. He would turn on the TV, let the background sound fill the void, and the two of us would sit there, ignoring the growing distance between us. There were no more meaningful conversations. There was no more exchange. There was no more us. I left the house before noon, needing air, space. The rain from the night before had given way to a cold, gray afternoon. The sky was covered in dense clouds, and the wind cut through my skin like a blade. I didn't know where I was going. Perhaps it was an attempt to find something that would make me feel less empty, some corner where I could think. But in truth, I knew where I was going. I was going to Harold. When I arrived at his house, the atmosphere was as welcoming as ever. The soft light inside seemed to oppose the cold outside, and the aroma of hot coffee enveloped me as soon as I entered. Harold was sitting at the table, a cup of tea in front of him, and when he saw me, his eyes softened. He knew something was wrong. He always knew. "You don't look well. What's wrong?" I sat down next to him, not knowing where to start. The weight of guilt was still on my mind, but there was also a sense of relief at being there, next to him, in a place where the words I spoke didn't seem to be judged. I didn't know what I was looking for at that moment, but I was there because something inside me needed that closeness. Not just to console myself, but to redeem myself. To feel that at least some part of me was still worth it. "Harold, I don't know what to do." The words came out in a tired sigh. "I cheated on Tom. With you." He didn't react immediately. He remained silent, looking at me with that almost disconcerting calm. I felt exposed, as if I had stripped naked in front of him, as if my shame was something he already knew, but that I still couldn't face. "Wendy," he finally said, his voice low and measured, but with a tone of sadness that made me hold my breath. "I knew something like this could happen, but you have to understand that the consequences of all this are profound. Not just for you, but for everyone. For Tom. For me too." I knew he was right. With every word he said, the pain deepened inside me. I knew that what I had done had broken something that couldn't be fixed easily. A line had been crossed, and despite all the desire and attraction between us, none of that changed the fact that I had betrayed someone who trusted me, who trusted us. "I know I did something unforgivable," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know what to do now. I don't know." Harold leaned forward and put his hand on mine. The touch was gentle, but the weight of it all was Wendy between us. He wasn't judging me, but I sensed that he also knew that words couldn't erase what had already been done. "You're going to have to face the consequences, Wendy. There's no going back," he said, firmly but without harshness. "But more than that, you need to decide what you want for the future. This isn't just about what happened between us. It's about what you really want for your life." I looked at him, feeling a tearing pain in my chest. I knew he was right. I couldn't live among the shadows forever. But at the same time, I feared what would come next. What would become of me, of Tom, of everything we had built. I felt like I was at a crossroads, and I didn't know which path to choose. The decision was in my hands, and despite everything, I still didn't know how to make it. That was the story, my loves. What did you think? Let me know in the comments. And if you liked it, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel by activating the notification bell so you don't miss any of the channel's daily videos.